Hi, everybody. My name is Luke. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about some interviews I did with social workers in Montana, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts about how they deal with stress. The title is I Deal with Evil, and I'll get more into that because there is evil in the field, but it's not what you think it is. It's not how it sounds. It's not the kids. It's the things that happen to them. I want to thank my advisor, Dr. Ann Garenbeck-Shim, before I go any further, and I want to give some scope. So after I graduate, I will be going into a group home to work for a couple years. And so, to be honest, the real goal of this was to kind of understand what I'm getting myself into, not so much to produce a paper or a presentation. And so a lot of the lessons I've learned from this have been the main deliverable, I guess you could say. So first I'll explain the evil and what it is, and then I'll talk about the methods and results of my project, and then I will talk about one finding, talking about the theory of intersubjectivity. It's a pretty small part of the larger paper, but I think it shows why social worker well-being is important to therapeutic outcomes for patients. So what is the evil? The evil comes from this quote from a Massachusetts foster care organization director. I'll read it out. "You saw a lot of what the history was on those children, so that could kind of wear on you. One of my favorite sayings is that I deal with evil. There's a lot of evil out there, and we see a lot of evil. We see the details of whatever abuse there might be, because children that come into care are here for a reason, right? They don't just get taken out of their homes by the state for no reason." When you hear this phrase, I deal with evil, I think it's kind of easy to assume that the evil might be the people that you're working with, but it's really not. It's the abuse that they go through and that you become aware of secondhand. In fact, the kids themselves are kind of protective factors for people that work in the field. They're cool to talk to, they're doing the best they can, they just need a lot of love. It's a huge reason of why people do this work is to work with kids. So if it's not the kids, what is it? It's the traumas and the hardships that they experience that leads them into needing care, and it's also the hardships that workers taking care of them experience in the process. So to talk about some methods and results, I emailed 39 social workers last fall, and I held 9 interviews anonymously over Zoom. Well, I know who they are, you don't. With social workers in Montana, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire. Their occupations included primary attachment counselors, group home directors, foster care directors, that sort of thing. So very applicable to what I'll be doing, specifically with group homes and foster care. Further research was done based on the interview comments to fill out the paper. And then, like I said, the deliverable is a paper guided by the interviews, not the research. Wanted it to be very person-centered. As a result of that, the results are the interviews. We'll talk about the stressors and the protective factors. You can divide the stressors into 2, the clinical and the administrative. Clinical includes secondary trauma, so being traumatized by the trauma that you're witnessing. Burnout, which is the idea of having not enough resources and too much work. Absorption vulnerability, which is sort of similar to secondary trauma, but it has to do with the things that you've gone through in your own life. If your narrative and the narrative of your patient overlap, the developmental triggers that you have can kind of be pulled up by the developmental triggers that they have, and it can be a lot harder to be present in sessions. And then traumatic experiences in a clinical setting. So that's usually when someone in your care or yourself is at threat of danger or has actually experienced harm. Administrative stressors include staffing issues, funding issues, lack of control in the clinical setting, and training issues like continuing ed and on-site training. All of these administrative stressors kind of amplify the effects that this evil can have. To get a little lighter, though, there's a lot of protective factors, too. Interpersonal relationships are huge. Family, work relations, therapy, friends, and especially the kids. They're the reason people do it, like I said. Self-care is important. I think it has its place. It's not great for everything. Like if you've been through a trauma, maybe don't just do self-care, but it's good for what it's good for. Exercise, sleep, diet, and routine. And administrative care is huge, and it's not talked about enough. Supervision should be mandatory for everyone. Training is critical, continuing ed, and as much staffing as possible. Pretty much everywhere has staffing problems. So now we're going to talk about intersubjectivity. It's not a huge part of the paper, but I think it's really cool. And it gives you a good idea of why social worker well-being is important to the outcomes of their patients, like I said. We have to look back a little bit, though. The traditional transference model is kind of you have a subjective patient and an objective therapist. This subjective patient transfers their emotional content onto the therapist, and the therapeutic work is done by analyzing what this emotional content is. It's kind of paternalistic in the sense that it describes therapists as these all-knowing objective figures that can kind of save a patient, and that's not true at all. This new model, the intersubjective model, came out in the 70s and 80s, following in Carl Rogers' footsteps. He was very humanistic, and I think it's a lot more open. He talks a lot. Orange and Stolero, the people that developed intersubjectivity, talked about subjective fields. So there's the patient's subjective field and the therapist's subjective field. They don't position the therapist as objective or any, more emotionally aware than the patient. They're both subjective people, and these subjective fields include their emotional well-being, their physical well-being, any developmental traumas or experiences they've gone through, anything that you can think of that makes up what a person is that's in their subjective field. We all have them. And the therapeutic work is done in the intersection, the intersubjectivity between the two subjective fields. And one subjective field can impact the other, and as we'll see in this next clip, subjective fields can change in ways that you might not expect. So this is an interview clip from a clinical services director in Montana. Oh, did the audio not go in? No, that's okay. I can read it out. This is not my experience, I'm just reading it out. When I was a therapist doing direct clinical work, I was in the areas of trauma, sexual abuse, sexual exploitation. And I did really good until one incident happened, right? And do you have any guesses what that is? It's when I had my first daughter. When I had my first daughter, I could not sit in those sessions and not see her. Because I was taking on all of the stories that were being shared with me. Like my story started to get jumbled with their stories, and I had to do something different. And it's when I moved into a clinical supervision role. I could still use my knowledge, but I had to do it in a different way because I could no longer separate who I was from what I was hearing in a way that was healthy for them and that was healthy for me. So if we put this in the perspective of the intersubjective field, we've got the patient's subjective field, these women who have experienced sexual exploitation and abuse, and a male therapist and his subjective field. The content that they were bringing to the sessions didn't change at all. Their subjective field didn't change. But with the birth of his daughter, his subjective field changed, and it became harder for him to be present in the sessions. And so it was harming his relationships. He was really good at it for a long time, and when his daughter was born, he kept seeing her. And you can't really do good therapeutic work if you're constantly seeing your daughter in the chair. So what he had to do was he switched from a therapeutic role into a clinical supervision role, where he kind of supervised the people that were now doing his job. And I think that this anecdote speaks a lot to the fact that if you aren't able to do the work, your patients aren't going to get the best outcomes. And he had to recognize that for himself. And he did a really good job at it. He trains on secondary trauma and this sort of thing. So I think it's a great example of it. Like I said, this isn't like the biggest conclusion of my paper, but I think it speaks to why social worker well-being is important to outcomes. And this is what like sections of my paper would look like, is you have theory and background, and then you have clips from the actual interviews to kind of paint a picture for them. Thanks for your time.
All right, we have some time for questions.
Hi,
Hello.
Cal.
Great job.
Thank you, Cal.
I just wanted to know, so you mentioned at the beginning that, this is a field that you're going into. You're going to work in a group home this summer. And I wanted to know, like, if you could elaborate a little bit more on, like, what you're taking away from this into that role, or kind of, if you have, like, a main takeaway or two that you're saying, okay, this has changed my, the way that I think about this, and what I'm going to take into my future roles.
Yeah, absolutely. So last summer I worked at a group home in Montana, and I was like one of the summer program directors. So you basically worked from 8 to 4, Monday through Friday, and you take the kids on outings, that sort of thing, just kind of try to have fun with them. Not super therapeutic or intense. It got intense, but it doesn't have to. And this summer I'll be going back as like a primary attachment counselor. So you're kind of like a father figure to the kids for like the 2 years that they're there or so. And in going through the process of changing roles, the like house manager and the house therapist have kind of brought to me like, yeah, like consider your developmental triggers and like the things that stressed you out when you were in the home last time, and find ways to kind of process them in therapy before you get here. You don't have to have them fully processed out. No one ever does, but be aware of what they are so you can handle them when you're in that role. Because if you're a parent figure, it's a lot more important to be able to do that than if you're just summer program. So yeah, thanks for the question.
Yeah, other questions?
Did you find that the interviewees spoke about the trauma of the burnout of the staff turnover, like the effect that has on the kids? And if so, what did they say?
Yeah, absolutely. A couple of the first interviews I did that aren't really playing a huge role in the paper themselves because they felt a little too close to home were with people that I worked with last summer, and we had a decent bit of staff turnover, and you could tell how it affected the kids. That made it a lot harder for them to regulate in the home because like the parent figures were having turnover, and they talked a lot about that in the interviews. So yeah, that's a great example of like the administrative issues of not having enough staffing amplifying what you might call the evil, where it's like these kids have learned that the only way they can get attention is by getting dysregulated and kind of blowing up because of the evil things that have happened to them in the past, and because we don't have enough staffing to give them the attention that they deserve and need, they have to find different ways to get it. So.
You talked about obviously how difficult and challenging this work can be, but also how rewarding it can be. Do you have a favorite memory or aspect of the job that you would want to share?
Ooh, that's a good question. We are like the guy who like mows the lawn and kind of like cleans the house, like does the plumbing and stuff at the group home. He like went to the Olympics for the US in like the 70s to like throw like discus, and like one morning it was like a morning at the end of like kind of a rough week, and he was like, hey, like the Olympics are going on, can I like come show you guys like my old discs that I threw with and stuff like that. So like at the end of like kind of a rough week, it was fun to take like the 6 kids that we had out to the yard and just like they got to just throw like an Olympic disc around. It was cool. It was fun.
All right, we have time for one more question. Yeah, in the back.
Hi, Luke. Thanks so much for your presentation. First, I really commend what you're doing and your future path. I think both as aspiring mental health professionals, this is really great to be researching. I was wondering how you were able to locate your interviewees and if you think that this helped you find a community, a professional community for you.
Yeah, I think it did. I kind of, because in Missoula, where I'm from, Missoula, Montana, the group homes are pretty like interconnected. You kind of know people that work in the other group homes. And my initial thought was to email like the house managers at each of the big group homes there. And then kind of from there, I started emailing down the list. It was basically just cold calling at a certain point, especially here in Mass. Like I was just kind of emailing anybody that I could find. Yeah, but I do feel like the people that I met were very helpful resources, not just for the research.
All right, that's all the time we have.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much. And Pedro will be up next.